Yeah.
There you go. Well, Augustus Caesar is reputed to have said the more complex a problem is, the simpler should be the solution. We don't know whether he was being earnest or sarcastic or ironic or what, but he said it. On the other hand, the American journalist H.L. Mencken said that for every complex problem, there is an answer that is simple, clear, simple, and wrong. And by the way, he also said a professor must have a theory as a dog must have fleas. Well, enough of that. But my favourite quotation, I think, is from the very first stanza of the four quartets. Humankind cannot bear very much reality. There you are, 1936. Our opposite for 2025. Well, when Mami Mitsutori was the head of UNRR, she wrote on page 6 of the midterm report on the Sendai framework for the same, that progress has stalled and in some cases reversed. And that is the list of things that she gave as the reasons why that is so, to which I have added the interaction of conflict and disasters, which you might well have put in there because it is equally important. But these are some of the reasons. After 44 years and 364 days of studying disaster, I have come to the conclusion that disasters are caused by ideology. If you want a good illustrative example of that, look at the Texas floods of the 4th of July this year. 135 people were killed in those. Why? Well, if you look at the history of that particular area, you can find that conscious decisions were made not to install a warning system, not to zone the area as dangerous because at risk of flooding, despite the fact that that was well known, not to take account of the weather forecast, and so on. In my view, that could only be attributed in final analysis to some form of ideology. I also think that we are perhaps at the end of the second age of enlightenment. Reading the recently published history of the end of the first age by Richard Watmore, thank you very much. This is a wonderful tradition. I drink your health very willingly. Perhaps this will improve my discourse. There are parallels with what is going on now. Absolutely. And as we move into the supposed age of artificial intelligence, we should perhaps ask ourselves why, when we have more and more means to be enlightened, we have less and less opportunity for it. Now, Henry Quarantelli, the father of disaster sociology, wrote very prophetically quite a long time ago that technology leads a double life, that which its makers intended and that which they did not intend. And in fact, if we look at artificial intelligence, what we find is there are a lot of drawbacks to it. Yes, it is going to be useful, no doubt about it. But when you look at what it is capable of doing, and also even when you look at the financing of it and ask whether in fact there is a bubble there about to burst, as in the .com episode 20 years ago, well, we wonder about it. There are a lot of questions here that need to be answered before we can make full, fair and free use of artificial intelligence. And perhaps the agenda of the creators of it, the money makers of society, might be relevant here. We need to look at root causes of disaster. What root causes? Well, I believe, apart from the fact that we have somewhat forsaken vulnerability, which is the absolute essence of the understanding of disaster, we also have not adequately tackled how to incorporate context. And I would define context there as all of those factors that don't have a direct impact upon the progress of the disaster, but nevertheless indirectly influence it. And there is always, for example, a political context. So in fact, I have made models of context. They resulted in the paper I submitted getting rejected, but you can't win them all. But a simple model like the fried egg one, where we have the various components directly of disaster. Vulnerability, perhaps the greatest explainer, but we need to get right back to the root causes. I will provide an example shortly. However, around that, we have the white of the egg. It is very difficult to be resilient against disaster if you are not resilient against life itself. If you are living under a bridge and are homeless, if you have no employment, if you are sick, ill, disabled, whatever, then it is very difficult to be resilient against specific topics. Now, looking at that in a more formal way, we could say that specific vulnerability, for example, to floods or to COVID, or indeed even to warfare, is a subset of general vulnerability to an awful lot of other things. And what I'm trying to suggest there is that we can't really understand specific vulnerability unless we understand general vulnerability first. There is some new research on that, not by me, but I discovered I stumbled across it in my usual bibliographic searches, and that perhaps is heartening. But we need also to deal with complexity, which is one of the great features of modern life, as we all know only too well. So in that, there are a variety of particular things that should occupy us. And let's look at one or two of them. We haven't time to look at them all. We haven't time really to characterize complexity enough, but we can make some progress in that. So we've got various kinds of complexity, except that with a diagram like this, it is perhaps rather difficult to say that they're all mutually exclusive categories. They're probably not in any way. But nevertheless, the risk of disaster, the risk of crises and so on is definitely made up of interconnections between things, including very often things that we might not expect to be interconnected. Now, Abraham Maslow produced this pyramid of fundamental human needs in 1942. I have been arrogant enough to add a layer to it, which is connection. You might argue that that is a subset of belonging, but I think the way that things have gone, the way that things are going, we require a separate layer for it. We live in networked societies. If the networks break down or if they manage to propagate something noxious, then we have very serious problems. And one of the problems we particularly have is the increasing gap between perceived reality and objective reality. We as scientists are trained to assume that there is one reality that we pursue. What we tend to find is that there are innumerable realities simply because people believe things. So we have what we might call manufactured reality, which is something which normally we wouldn't wish to test, we would discount and forget about, but we cannot afford to do so because enough people believe it. If one or two people believe that vaccination is a conspiracy, it's not a problem. But we need herd immunity to many diseases, which involves about 95% vaccination. If large swathes of the population think there is a conspiracy behind the vaccination exercise, then we have a manufactured reality that somehow we have got to tackle. I do believe that as scientists, social scientists, or whatever, as academics, we have failed so far to find a way to tackle problems on social media because we're simply not in that domain ourselves. We don't think like Trump. We don't think like Bolsonaro. In fact, we find it very hard, I do anyway, to imagine how they do think, because much of what they think seems to be detached from reality. It is unverifiable because it simply doesn't have that background of reality to verify. If we look at the misuse of the internet, for example, we have perhaps 4 domains where this takes place, and we have a gradual shift over time towards the bottom of the diagram. In other words, towards authoritarianism and extremism propagated digitally. Whether that is a shift away from things like sabotage is perhaps debatable, because we also obviously have transformations in kinds of warfare. We didn't really have undersea warfare beforehand. It might have had its antecedents, but we didn't have it. And we are now facing in Europe questions of sabotage, as well as these two, namely authoritarianism and extremism. But somehow the world has got to adapt to the digital reality, and we obviously need to think of ways where we can effectively combat this. The loss of trust is one of the great problems. If you read the disaster literature, the social literature, you find that trust is a key issue just about everywhere. And if we have loss of trust in authority, perhaps because authority is unreliable, many of the populists are thoroughly unreliable, then we're going to get loss of trust, and that will compromise our ability to put across good, true, safe, and sane arguments. The risk is that we descend into a state of what Durkheim in his, Emil Durkheim in his 1893 book on labour described using the resurrected old French word anomie as a form of nihilism, which is the result of the breakdown of standards and the abandonment of values and principles. And if that happens, then we're almost bound to have a lack of disaster governance when we most need it in this complex world. And so to the question of cascading disasters. Now, I could try and say that my research group did much of the fundamental work on that, but that would be an outright lie, because in point of fact, it was largely my student, Gianluca Pescaroli. He was my PhD student. He's now a full professor, and has very much overtaken me, who did much of the most useful work. Particularly work on one of the two defining characteristics of the cascade, namely the escalation point. In a cascade path, escalation points can help define the cascade, sometimes more than the triggering event. So you might think of the simple model as being the cascading dominoes one, where one effect leads to another. And what slightly worries me about this symposium is I haven't heard anyone define cascades, nor have I heard anyone actually explain the cascade itself, much as the phrase cascading disaster has been used here. So perhaps we should think about what are the linkages that create the cascade, especially in diagram B, where escalation points can create the bigger disaster. For example, on the 11th of March 2011, there was a magnitude 9 earthquake on the Nankai Trough, which led to a tsunami up to 39.5 meters high and about 24,000 people being killed in the Tohoku region on the Sanriku coast of northeast Japan. Now, what was the major disaster? Was it, in fact, the earthquake? No, I think not 100 people died in it. Was it the tsunami? Possibly 24,000 dead. Or was it, in fact, the nuclear release? I have been 4 times to Fukushima Daiichi. I recall last time standing 80 meters away from reactor 1, which was still beaming out radiation, streaming out radiation at the rate of 350 chest X-rays. And that is something officially will take 30 years to remedy. In practice, it might well take a century. 3,640 people work there around the clock and will do so for the next few decades without any generation of electricity. And by the way, up the road, there is the Onagawa nuclear plant, which has a 29-meter high sea wall and now has the most advanced security protection in the world, which took 30 years for 4,000 people round the clock day and night to create. And they have finally restarted one of the reactors of it. The unit cost of electricity must be absolutely off the scale. But then we've got the single point of failure as another thing. Now, when this rather small electricity switching substation caught fire on the 20th of March this year, as a result of short circuit causing cooling oil to catch fire, it stranded 200,000 people because it shut down electricity to Terminal 5 and other parts of Heathrow Airport, the busiest in Europe. And that was indicative of a single point of failure that could then propagate failure with all the consequences of a single failure propagating through a series of other fields. In other words, what were people doing? Meetings were missed, important appointments, effects upon tourism, costs to the aviation industry, blah, blah, blah. So it goes on. So in fact, we have networks usually of different kinds of propagation of the cascade, which can lead us to secondary and indirect impacts, any of which might in the end be more important than the primary cause. The primary cause in the Heathrow case was practically negligible, but there was no way around that substation. I suppose now there must be, because they will have learned that lesson. It was a defective piece of equipment, and that was all. So in fact, now there is a lot of influence, lot of interest in single points of failure as the start of cascades. But cascades, as we have seen in the Heathrow case, tend to propagate through critical infrastructure. There were quite interesting consequences of the collapse of this bridge. Not much was on it at the time, and there were no casualties, but it led to all sorts of problems of distribution and travel for different categories of people. And so I would say the critical infrastructure is the principal vehicle by which disasters produce cascading impacts. It's not the only one, but it is the principal one. And if you want to understand it fully, you've got to understand all dimensions: physical, technological, cyber, and social. At a very boring conference, quite different from this workshop, I sat down during an absolutely intolerable set of talks and mapped out everything I could think of in terms of the consequences of not having electricity. One example: supposing you can't milk cows. You think, oh, well, you sit down with a three-legged stool and a galvanized steel bucket. Well, you can't do that if you have a herd of 200. I mentioned this to someone, and they said, oh, yes, in Hokkaido, we had a blackout for about 2 days, and it led to a milk shortage in convenience stores in the south of Honshu. Bearing in mind there are 28,000 convenience stores in Japan. That, in fact, was quite a big issue. But think about it. Now, another example comes from the Noto Peninsula earthquake of the 1st of January 2024. One of my pictures of the city of Wajima, the center of which was obliterated by post-earthquake fire. And what happened there was that the roads were impassable, there were 20,000 landslides, bridges collapsed, the airport was non-functional, helicopters couldn't fly because of the weather conditions, the port had been shifted out of the Sea of Japan, 4.1 meters vertically as a result of permanent displacement, and therefore it was very, very difficult to provide aid. At least 58 people died from hypothermia because they couldn't be rescued, because nobody could get to them to rescue them. Something similar occurred in the summer of 2024, and the whole area was then afflicted by major floods. Anyway, moving on, we need to look at intersectionality, which is a term I have borrowed from the study of race, gender, and culture. I hope they don't mind too much, but I actually mean something different, with no disrespect to their work. What I mean here are forms of disaster causality that intersect, different kinds of disaster that intersect, disaster in its context that intersects, and disaster that intersects with social circumstances. If you live in Kashmir, for example, you've got the heightened tension between India and Pakistan at the same time as you've got things like glacial outbursts, valley floods, and debris flows, and all the rest of it intersecting with each other. During COVID, we had 3 major earthquakes, which were Croatia, Japan, and Turkey, Greece. And all of those required a different management technique that was rather incompatible with managing COVID occurring simultaneously. Now, you probably know a lot more about all of this than I do, but it occurs to me that the modern connotations of many of these terms are actually less than 400 years old. And we also seem to have a process of mutation of the meaning of these terms. In other words, new interpretations or debased interpretations even. And those will add to the complexity of disaster. What indeed is sovereignty in disaster? We have talked a great deal about the democracy and the human rights. The cat is out of the bag when it comes to human mobility, and it will not be something we can contain in the future. So what exactly is that going to mean? What is identity in the face of things like human rights, mobility, and so on? And an example of how that matters, this is the town of Oldham, or is it in fact the town of Bolton? But it matters not, they are next door to each other and they share the same destiny. And I put that picture in specifically because when decisions were made about managing COVID, they had a particularly high resonance for these places, which are the poorest urban communities in the United Kingdom. That means that there were many people who inhabited the same room. Many people who were on the front line as delivery drivers, bus drivers, nurses, and so on, and were more susceptible to getting COVID and indeed dying from it. It's also worth noting that the first 12 doctors to die in the UK were all ethnic minority doctors. The planning simply did not allow for ethnic minorities to be protected particularly. Well, we need foresight. At the moment, I was trying to found a foresight institute and create a foresight network. And I would define in this context, there are kinds of foresight, in this context, foresight as the structured investigation of possible future outcomes that we can feed into emergency planning and emergency decision making. I had the luxury of a 40-minute conversation with the Deputy Prime Minister of Japan. They are worried about this sort of thing because at any time they might have another magnitude 9 earthquake on the Nankai Trough further south and an 18-meter ice tsunami affecting 60 million people who live close to sea level between Tokyo and Kobe. So foresight might help us with that. It will not automatically prepare us for events that are simply overwhelmingly large, or for which we cannot justify investment in proper preparedness, but it could at least stop the kind of rabbits in their headlights kind of approach that we had at the beginnings of COVID, where many countries simply did not know what to do, despite the fact that we had the scenarios made up a decade before. And for example, in the United Kingdom, before COVID struck, there were 9 pandemic exercises, and they all produced reports and recommendations that were routinely and roundly ignored. So foresight, I think, is important, especially as in the past we have tended to rely on past disasters to tell us what to do about future ones. We have the Gaussian curve, bell-shaped. We assume the next disaster is going to be in the middle of the curve, not too small, not too large, not too unusual, kind of thing that happens once every 10 years. Well, it probably won't be. It'll probably be quite different. So foresight actually would operate in the grey area between things we know, the determinism, things we don't know and cannot know, and things we can constrain by probability. And in that sense, we might at least be able to get a better handle on these of work. In Britain, foresight exercises, the last one showed up about 17 different things that we ought to be looking at, and mostly aren't, as it happened. So, given that we've got greater magnitude and frequency of meteorological events already, particular importance as well for wildfire in the heating world, that is going to be a major shaper of the human experience in the future. We have the possibility of proliferating technological failure. That's a couple of cables and about a quarter of Africa is off the internet, for example. Exceptionally large geophysical events, the very large earthquake or the VEI-7 volcanic eruption, volcanic explosivity index, unplanned mass migration on a very large scale, intersectional conflict and disasters that we already have, and any possible emerging hazards and threats. Let's remember that influenza of the non-seasonal variety has about a 40-year cycle of recurrence. It is uneven, and the degree of lethality and transmissibility is highly variable. But what if the next one were on a level with 1918 to 1920? So we would feed foresight into scenario development. We don't need a scenario, we need a suite of scenarios. The worst case, the best case. We can do the counterfactual analysis developed by the analyst Gordon Wu, a very talented and clever person he is too. When we look at past events and we say, well, what if it had been worse? That's downward counterfactual analysis. Or what if it had been better? And we apply that to present and future conditions. So to conclude, as I really ought to do, I would like to use this example for a start. Grenfell Tower was a 24-storey residential block in an extremely rich area, but full of extremely poor people. And it caught fire as a result of a short circuit on floor 4. And by the morning, the fire had spread over the entire building. The entire lot was inflammable. Something like that should never, ever happen, given knowledge of building techniques that we have in the 21st century. And it did. So what does that mean? Well, here's the general model. You've got the direct causes. It was a short circuit in a refrigerator in a kitchen. You have the longer-term dynamic pressures, the pressure to make money out of avoiding the building regulations. You have the root causes, which are the decimation of the building regulations and the inspection regime, and the creation of loopholes whereby flammable material could be used to clad buildings. You have a context of ideology around all of that, and then you have cascading effects. Well, initially, the cascading effects were in West London where it occurred. Within days, they had spread to the whole of London, where other tall buildings with flammable cladding had been discovered, tall residential buildings. That then spread to the United Kingdom, where 5,000 such buildings with people in them were discovered. And that then connected to similar fires in Australia, Dubai, Kazakhstan, and France. That is panarchy. In other words, the gating effects marched along together at different scales, different geographical scales, with some degree of interconnection between them. Another question, finally, is resilience could actually be described as an illusion. Now, why do I say that? Well, resilience is a concept that is about 2,100 years old. In science, it arrived in the English language in 1625. We tend to get our idea of resilience from the work of Prof. Stanley Holling in 1973. He was an ecologist. He loved studying small islands because they are closed systems for mass and open systems for energy. The idea, though, is that when a system is disturbed, it will return to an equilibrium. If that is a past equilibrium, we can call it bounce back. If it's a future equilibrium, let's call it bounce forward. Okay, but we don't have an equilibrium. If you want to think of it in more homely terms, think of a football match where the goalposts are being shifted all the time. And we've got to the stage now where the goalposts are moving faster than the players can run. Therefore, where is the homeostasis? Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't say, I'm not saying resilience is rubbish, let's go away from it and forget it, so on. What I'm saying is we've just got to bear in mind that resilience is probably unattainable because of the constant shift in circumstances and its need for stability. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't try and obtain it. Actually, that is parallel to the paradox of vulnerability. I think vulnerability is a better measure than resilience. It's not about the opposite of resilience, because you can be both vulnerable and resilient simultaneously. However, the trouble with vulnerability is it's almost impossible to measure directly because it's like friction. There is no friction when a body is resting on a surface. When a force is applied, the body moves and it mobilizes friction. And by the time you get there, it's over, the body has moved, the friction has stopped. And hence that is analogous to vulnerability, which we can only really observe in the abstract of our proxies. Anyway, finally, a central question is, what is the value in the modern world of hard scientific information in this age of relativism, in this age of post-truth, of alternative realities, so-called, and all the other euphemisms of nonsense that we have? Well, Hogan and Chomsky studied it a long time ago and continued to do so thereafter. Worth reading. So anyway, I thank you very much for listening and greatly.
And now we open for discussion. I see that Deborah is eager to speak first. So Deborah, please.
It's a very hard act to follow. First of all, many, many thanks. I'm going to start with two broad questions. And the first is really from reading your essay as well as the presentation. You really, in the essay particularly, offer an incisive and eloquent diagnosis of broader societal forces shaping contemporary disaster risk, especially when you frame context. We're so used to saying context matters, but that it's an often ignored driver of vulnerability. And I found this particularly compelling. And my question is, how do you see disaster scholars and practitioners realistically integrating such a broad, multidimensional understanding of context into some actionable policy, given that many governments actively resist or deny the very social and political realities that produce risk?
Well, I wrote a paper exactly about that. I sent it for publication and it got kicked out right away. I only hope that was that I sent it to the wrong journal, perhaps.
I'd love to read it.
It does have unsolvable problems, but I will, when I can nerve myself up enough, try and get it published again. What I've done was to try to make a model of context. And the way I've done that was by disaggregating context into a series of categories. The idea there being that you look at what the context is for each category and then you put the lot together holistically at the end. Whether that works or not is an open question, but I did try and pepper the paper with examples. Evidently, the referees didn't like it at all. But,
when it's ready, I would love to read it.
Well, one way or the other, it's going to come out when I get around to it. Trying to make a model of it. In terms of the academic community and the practitioner community, in too many cases, it's business as usual. In other words, it's looking at the narrow perspective on things without understanding that things have moved beyond that, very far beyond it, moreover. And that we're not living in that same world. There is still a naive belief that you give the decision makers the knowledge and they will say, oh, thank you, we will now put this into effect immediately. I can recall going to the global platform of the United Nations in Geneva, and there were 6,000 people debating what to do about disasters and so on. And it was the same day as the Oxfam report on the distribution of wealth came out that told us that the number of people who own half of the world's disposable wealth has shrunk from 42 to 34. You could get them onto a bus very easily, except that none of them would ever travel by bus. And that wasn't even mentioned by anyone, but this is fundamental because the resources we need are tied up, and they're tied up by people who are not going to release them to reduce the risk of disaster, despite the fact that this is compounding very fast and all over the world.
Mm-hmm.
So what I'm trying to say there is I don't know the answer.
Right. Okay. And there are so many questions that, arise, but I'll ask just one more. And then there are other people. So I also really appreciated how powerfully you connect the current global political and economic trends to the erosion of our ability to manage disaster risk. and your discussion of the collapse of trust and the post-trust, post-truth environment is especially resonant. Now, it made me wonder, in a world where trust in institutions is declining, where truth is framed differently, or becomes questionable, and what practical strategies do you believe can help reestablish legitimacy needed for effective disaster risk reduction?
It's hard to say. When I said that disasters were caused by ideology, I was also thinking of the Grenfell Tower case, which effectively began when the Prime Minister decreed, perhaps a dozen years previously or more, that for every rule, regulation that was enacted, two would be abolished. Now, there's no logical reason, no scientific reason for doing something like that, but what it led to is the abolition of safety standards. And that, therefore, is an indication of how ideology constrains and causes disaster. It is the root cause is a desire to abolish regulations under this ideological idea that we're better off without them, that some form of anarchy would enable us to make more money and be richer. Well, some of us anyway. So I can recall going down to Grenfell Tower. I left it a few days because you don't go immediately after a thing, but when I got there about 4 days afterwards, there were people literally rolling in the gutter with post-traumatic stress disorder. There was a sense of outrage, but the trouble with public outrage is it doesn't last long enough, and it often doesn't translate into action. And that's where the rub is. That's where we somehow, I don't think we should be permanently outraged. We're reasonable people on an even keel, and we don't wish to live in a state of permanent outrage. But on the other hand, what we've somehow got to do is bring principle back into public life. And that's where we have real difficulties, because let's remember that leaders are role models. They may not be role models for all. I would hate to think of Donald Trump or Bolsonaro to be my role model, but they are, as we have heard and as we know, role models for significant numbers of people. Even the most awful of these people are role models. And that somehow has to be counteracted, but we've got to put our heads together and work out how to do it, because frankly, I don't know.
Yeah. Thank you.
Ali.
Yeah, I also have two general questions, and the first also relates to what I wanted to ask yesterday after Anna's discussion, but Ido told me that time is up. So, and it's about the limits of comparison, right? So in the case of the talk yesterday, we have, I think, a strong tendency to compare to Nazi Germany so many events because it's such a huge part of our past, and I often wonder to what extent it limits us to make like proper comparison to the most similar events. And in your really interesting presentation, I was wondering about something that I think that we face a lot in our center, which is other limitations of the comparison between natural disasters and human-made ones. Should we have similar lessons from earthquakes and wars? I'm not sure what the answer is. I think that there might be some significant differences in the way that we should approach this type of disasters and risks, and I would love to hear your thoughts. And the second is I totally share the sense of collapse of truth and trust and everything. But here again, I wonder to what extent can we distinguish between like totally rogue actors that intentionally try to ruin the notion of truth by spreading false information and so on, and reasonable different positions about how we perceive the world, because it seems to me that many reasonable people have really strong positions regarding the adversary and their approach to truth and lies and so on. And to me, at least for myself, one of the main lessons is self-reflection. And I wonder what role should it have in some type of solution to the current state that we're at.
We've got idiots and opportunists who are idiots and idiots who are opportunists, and people who are rational.
Maybe opportunists as well.
Yeah. Sorry?
Rational people may be opportunists as well on occasion.
Well, I'm sure, the human condition, absolutely, yes, I stand corrected. But let's hope there are opportunists in a more palatable manner. Let's hope. The trouble with all of this is that the bad opportunists have refined the techniques of pouring scorn upon the rational people. Unfortunately, rational argument requires a degree of preparation, a degree of understanding, and a degree of ability to put it across, whereas most of what you hear from the populists consists of unverifiable statements that to someone sound good because they're simply made in that manner to sound good. You might ask yourself, what causes earthquakes? By the way, we shouldn't really call them natural disasters. Natural has its impact. Although I argue, because I wrote a book and published it in 1993 called Natural Disasters, and it's still in print, I would argue there's nothing more natural than the human tendency to cause disasters. But anyway, sophistry. What causes earthquakes? Two independent studies, one by Roger Billum of the University of Colorado and one by Monica Escaleras of Florida Atlantic University, suggest that the principal cause of earthquake disasters is corruption. They took a lot of variables. Now, of course, the problem there is you cannot measure corruption. If you go up to someone with a clipboard and say, "Excuse me, are you corrupt?" you're likely to have your feet encased in concrete and pushed into the river. However, it does appear that there is a degree of truth in this because if you have a proxy variable for corruption, it correlates with earthquake damage and effects more effectively than about 340 other variables do, according to Escaleras' analysis, which is fairly convincing. And if you look, for example, at the Turkish earthquakes of the 6th of February last year, what do you see? Well, Turkey has had building codes since 1930. Since 2017, it's had excellent building codes. They weren't bad before that, but 150 of the greatest experts got together to improve the building codes. We find that the president of Turkey produced a special fund by taxing mobile phone usage to retrofit buildings. And in a number of cases, that was used to build super elevations, in other words, further floors on buildings that were thoroughly unsafe in the first place and became doubly unsafe as a result. And Turkey also has excellent seismic engineers who have catalogued in great detail. There are about 12 key papers, the defects of Turkish reinforced concrete construction. So we know all there is to know, and yet at the same time we have 100,000 residential buildings pancaking as a result of a large earthquake, and more to follow. So we really do have to ask ourselves, when is the world going to get serious about doing something about this? The trouble with a lot of this is that people who get the jobs in government, they're often cycled through this. So in fact, you build a relationship with someone in the Civil Protection Office and then they're gone. They've gone into some other department of government and we have a neophyte there in their place. That's one problem. Secondly, there often aren't jobs at all, or they're badly paid, or they're part-time, or whatever. We end up not making emergency plans. Emergency planning is not so much a product, but a process, and above all, a process of finding out and deciding what we might do under certain circumstances. and it is therefore vital. We have a lack of leadership at the top. We have the failure to the system that we need, which needs to be integral at the national, regional, and local levels, with particular emphasis on the last of these. All of that needs to be done. We need civil protection systems merely to respond to disasters that are an order of magnitude bigger than what we've got now. 2 summers ago, we had 20,000 people fighting fires in the south of France. Well, next time around, we need, we had 2,000 people. Next time around, we'll need 20,000. I'm afraid. And if you don't believe me, just look at what's going on and the trajectories of what is going on.
So the foresight. Yeah, just to say, I showed it as single data on the fire. So we need to mitigate. So my questions, comments relate this wonderful lecture to the work we're doing. And in our previous meeting in Stemker that was mentioned, though some of those slides were shown.
Yeah.
The idea of how we started with the question of what is cascading? How should we make sense of those non-lawyers literature, which non-lawyers are in, but I mean by that they actually know what they're talking about, because us lawyers, what do we know? What do we make? How do we make legal sense of? And then we came up with the idea of categorization, that you should talk about cascading and compound as 2 different things that are compound or 2 totally unrelated events that may happen in temporal proximity, each of which may be cascading and may be cascading with respect to each other, and to distinguish it from a single event, and then there are cascading. Well, that's number 1. And then what is cascading? And what we came up with is the language that they use is cascading impact. That's nice. But what do we do with this impact? So we said, well, let's reintegrate our literature and say the impact can be a crisis. The impact can be an emergency in and of itself. And the impact can be a disaster. That is an emergency that wasn't dealt with. And then a disaster in and of itself, the lineage could be, this tsunami, but, if a hospital now collapses, it could be a tsunami, it could be something else, but, there's a disaster in and of itself now. Okay. So we try to make it. Why? Because, and again, it can be linear or non-linear. Why is it important? Because from a legal perspective, different legal tools apply, institutions, procedures. We have to integrate it to the legal regulatory reality. To add to that, the law itself regulates the processes of disaster. The law regulates mitigation and preparedness. The law regulates response, and the law regulates recovery. Of each of, with respect to each of these. So in a weird way, if your preparedness for a shock that was generated through a cascading was not good, it was not good, there's a legal implication to that. And then you should change regulation or not change in institutions and procedures. And okay, so that was part of it. But just to make it interesting, the law itself is part of the vulnerability. So regulation, the regulatory dimension is in and of itself part of the vulnerability that now either escalates or may escalate or may make more dangerous or whatever the spread of the cascading event. Okay, so we should have had you also there in okay. So this is where we are. This is what we are struggling with, to take this. So this is our starting point, to take this and to see, okay, now let's try to make the best we can with that, to have a theory in mind, but also to have something that can be used by those who actually plan and those who actually have to regulate. There are clients out there, government clients, at least in Israel, that say, okay, tell us something about plans of recovery. Tell us, so this is just by way of trying to situate where we are. Now, this is particularly challenging when parts of the vulnerability are illiberalism, or those context-based. The context could be considered as a form. So if you talk about in an age where, as we talked about before, the very notion of expertise, the very notion of what is the reality, if this is part of the context within which you have to deal with it, it just adds another layer of complexity. You can see it as a form of mega vulnerability within which the very idea of vulnerability is then because, well, not vulnerable, why? Because God is with us. Or because we have the genius, oh, we'll survive, or, you know, there are all kinds of things that happen there. Which is all to say that each of the things that you mentioned is highly relevant to us, and which is to say, and I'll say a bit more about this in a concluding comment, we would love to find a way to integrate it to the project.
I think it's really fascinating. I can't respond to what you just said because there's just too much in it to respond to. But I was thinking about the Italian case, which perhaps has something to offer to the rest of the world. In the early 1980s, there was a series of disasters which convinced the country and the government that they had to have a better structure for managing emergencies. So from 1982 onwards, 4 bills were proposed to Parliament for designs of law. Eventually, one of them got as far as the President of the Republic, Scalfaro it was, who sent it back to Parliament because judged it to be unconstitutional. In this, there was a tension between the need to have a structure to manage exceptional circumstances and the risk that this would facilitate legally a coup d'etat, bearing in mind that both Italy and Britain had prototyped coups d'etat. They didn't get very far, but there were those who would have overthrown the government in the 1980s in both countries. And so, in fact, it took until 1992, 10 years to pass the law. It was a good law. It works. It created a system. The system is integral. It was by no means perfect. It then had to be changed in the sense that devolution, which passed many of the powers to the regions, which incidentally are also capable of making laws, had its effect in 1998. And of course, there were various changes which were much mirrored by what went on in Sweden at a later date. In fact, after the tsunami of 2004. But anyway, eventually it was possible to make this system, but there were great fears for 10 years that in passing such a law, it would be a green light to those who wanted to overthrow democracy. And this is always something of a background risk in passing laws about disaster. On the other hand, on a positive note, for 5 years I was the Director of Civil Protection Training for the region of Lombardy. I wrote a set of standards for training and got them passed into law by the regional government. And that was a way of institutionalizing the process of trying to make training homogeneous. The laws for civil protection tend to institutionalize the process of making managing the emergency more homogeneous. For example, you may have laws that require municipalities to have emergency plans. If you then actually have some kind of law that actually says how they should do it, that's even better. One thing that Italy did that was rather surprising was after a major landslide at mudflow that killed 154 people, it passed a law which contains a load of geology, which tells you you've got to look at the vulnerabilities of that site, you've got to look at the physics of it, all the things it specifies to the last detail what 20 regions have got to do to map, codify and understand the mudflow and landslide pattern. Which in some ways is quite remarkable, but it is an indication of what laws can do. Whether they should do that, I don't know, but certainly what they can do. The other thing, very quickly, is ordinances. Italy has had problems with ordinances. Now, these are laws that last for 30 days. They can be passed at any level from national to local. For example, an ordinance that says you must evacuate. It doesn't say you must evacuate for the rest of your life or the rest of the year, but it says you must evacuate until this ordinance is either renewed or rescinded, and so on. The trouble was that this was found to be an excellent way of bypassing due process. When you had to get something done quickly, you used an ordinance because you didn't have all the form filling in, all the debate, discussion, ratification, and the rest of it. The trouble was that that was then used on an industrial scale for hundreds of millions of euros, and that then became a scandal. But that doesn't necessarily invalidate the concept of the ordinance. Maybe. Well, you're the expert anyway, you tell me.
Ellie, last comments?
I want to return to Yali's question about the suitability of this framework to what we define as crisis emergencies, which are more than disasters in your definitions. For example, economic crisis, terrorism, and democratic crisis as well. And for example, resilience, which in the sense of disaster is a very good thing, might be perceived in other kind of crisis as a negative thing, because if you are already used to all kinds of bad things, you have thick skin to progressing deterioration. So it would be nice if you can say a word about the suitability of the whole framework to what we think.
I think resilience is like cholesterol. There is good resilience and bad resilience. There is good and bad cholesterol. In Hurricane Katrina,
Let's link to that.
In Hurricane Katrina 2005, there was a strong movement in New Orleans against resilience, which they felt was used as a stick to beat them with, or a means of fooling them about things, and that it was undemocratic the way the concept was applied to, and wrong, inaccurate, in other words. So much is made of community. I mean, you can get Sigmund Bauman's book, Community, and read about the philosophy of community and so on. Well, many in this field believe that saint community can solve all manner of problems. Now, I used to live in two little communities. One of those was basically composed of two factions that were at each other's throats. The principal motor of that was sheer boredom. They were off the beaten track and they were bored out of their wits, so they got around that by hating each other, basically. The other was the most cosmopolitan part of London, where there was an enormously strong sense of community, a great sense of pride in the fact that this was the principal national centre for the distribution of illegal narcotic drugs. It was also the one place where 40,000 stolen telephones were processed a year. And there was great pride in that as well. And this, in effect, defined the community, which meant that we had the police around 3 times a week and the police helicopter overhead 2 nights a week. But that in no way dented the sense of community. I always laugh about this business of community solving problems. And so does my friend Terry Cannon, who's also been studying disasters for years, who found himself in a village in India and was introduced to the headman, and somebody said to him, well, you know, he's been really good about solving the floods problem. He's got people to do this and to do that. If they don't do it, he gets them killed. There was me taking hands with a mass murderer. And that was your sense of community. It was what's known as elite capture. Elite capture doesn't only occur in small villages in India. In fact, there is elite capture in London. The River Thames was rerouted into lower middle class areas from upper class areas, simply because they couldn't find any working class areas to send it to, for example. So, but I think one of the main problems we face, I don't know whether legislation could deal with it or what, theoretically legislation can, but is the problem of the cost of housing, which is now more or less universal. When you go to a city like London, I mean, I'm the 12th generation London, my family has been there for more than 400 years. And I've seen the price of housing grow enormously, the quality of housing diminish in the same manner. This absorbs a large portion of people's disposable income, and if they want to be more resilient in some manner, they haven't got the resources. It all goes into somebody's pocket. And you could say that the last 50 years or so have been a period of the mass transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich, as we move towards the creation of the world's first trillionaire. Who needs trillionaires? I mean, for me, the real existence of billionaires, trillionaires is obscene. And let's remember that during COVID, the world's 2,100 billionaires increased their net worth by 24% in 1 year and 57% the duration of the emergency. At the same time that the rest of us were all suffering, or most of us anyway.
On that happy note, on that happy note. Yeah, thank you very much.